Good evening, guys. How are we doing? Just checking over the attendance tonight. Looks like we got first and last names, and that's very exciting because that's how we do attendance these days. So we're okay there. Candace, I'm doing great. I am. Now that you say that, I went out to dinner with some old friends tonight, and for some reason they just kept on serving me margaritas. I don't know why. I've only asked for one, and then I got two. So I'm feeling pretty good on a Tuesday. And I just had to make sure I had to cut the party short because I said, look, everybody, I got to go back to 9 o'clock to do spotlight session. And that's what we're doing. That's right. I know, right? So we're kind of new. We're kind of new where we are, and we don't really know the restaurants very well. And it was nice. It was nice to kind of break up and go out and just kind of relax a little bit. And we went to this Cuban place, and um, it was a good time. So yeah, thank you for asking. So like I said, it's Tuesday. Last night we went over chapter 4 and chapter 5. We did a little interchronology. Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Leah. I do. It was a nice addition. Trust me. It was good to see some friends. So what we're doing, it seems like everybody's kind of everywhere, right? We had chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7. Maybe some people are maybe looking ahead and doing some chapter 8. And with my students, they've been kind of doing more cellular function and cellular biology, which is, you know, it's a lot of stuff there. Other folks are doing endocrinology. Is there anything that we want to go over tonight that we're a little soft on? We can start anywhere. We did a lot of female reproductive cycle last night, and I'm just going to try to open it up here and see if we have anything we want to go over. Do we want to touch on? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you. We can go over genes. Thank you, Candace. So, and please, as always, because I know you're one of my frequent flyers, and I thank you for that. I want you to kind of take this conversation what best fits you because genes are such a large concept. So, with genes are practically what makes us who we are, right? Genes are hereditary. Okay, we inherit genes from our mother and father. And really, what they do is that they have the genetic information that carries out what the feature is. It's kind of like if you remember from last night, I said structure yields function, right? Well, in this case, genes yield function. All right, genes yield function. So sometimes we can have genes that may give us blue eyes or brown hair or black eyes or have love handles like I do. Some people have cankles. These are all genes, the good and the bad, right? And you may realize that we might have inherited this somewhere down the line of of our family members, either on the maternal side or the paternal side. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know, right? Good and the bad. So what genes are is it's DNA. Okay, it's DNA at the nucleotide level. Adenosine, thymine, cytosine, guanine. And what happens is that when we were to go through transcription, right? Because we really when we're saying a gene is getting expressed, what does that actually mean? Okay? Because it took me more than what I care to admit how long when a professor says, what does it mean when a gene is being expressed? Does anybody let's just throw that question out there. What does it mean to you when a gene is being expressed? Type me out something. I swear to God, I'll wait here all night until we get something. Okay, yes, it's being noticed, right. It's being focused on. So Tristan says that proteins it codes for are being produced. That's pretty good. That's pretty good, Tristan. I'll take that. I can work off that. So when something is being expressed, what we are saying is that we are not only going through transcription, but we're also going through translation. All right. So what this is that yes, we have the gene, we've unraveled it in the chromosome because chromosomes are compact. We can't really do much expression, much DNA polymerase, RNase in a compact chromosome. So we've loosened up the chromosome. If we remember through mitosis, we're probably talking about, maybe metaphase, prophase, something like that, where it's more kind of like spaghetti. And then we have the DNA polymerase. Well, excuse me, we're not talking about DNA polymerase. We're talking about RNA polymerase because we're talking about transcription. So we have all our RNA polymerase. We're going to come through. We're going to make mRNA, right? We're going to replace thymine with uracil. And then all of a sudden, we're going to make that into a mature mRNA with the GCAP on the left-hand side, otherwise known as the 5' side. And then we're going to look at the 3' side, which is also known as the poly A tail, right? Then that tells us that we have a mature mRNA without introns because we spliced out the introns. So then we exit out into the cytoplasm, and then we go through what's called tRNA, translation. tRNA will come in, they'll read the codons of each of these mRNAs. These are 3 nucleotides per codon. And then it will start depositing each amino acid, starting with methionine. Methionine is always the first amino acid because it reads AUG. And so this gets to Tristan's point. When we start making, I thought I heard myself. Sorry, there threw me off. When we start making proteins, from what Tristan said, we are basically expressing the gene to make protein, because protein is what gives us our blue eyes. Protein is what gives us our brown hair, and et cetera, et cetera. So that is what we mean by when we express genes. Now, that's in normal circumstances, right? Well, we all know we have pathophysiology. Pathophysiology is basically what happens when the reading code or the reading frame, it's actually called the reading frame. I could not think about that last week. When the reading frame basically shifts, right? We have point mutations. And this is kind of what happens when we have classic diseases, syndromes known as I can't think of it right now. Cystic fibrosis is one I've gone through. What's the one where mosquitoes bite you in Africa and you plasmodium? Malaria. Yeah, thank you, Tristan. Malaria. Thank you, Candace. Malaria. Yep, Nicole, you're right. Malaria. That sometimes happens when people are actually resistant to malaria, which is interesting because through evolution, through hundreds of years, somehow where sometimes we have genetic shifts, point mutations that will block malarial infection. I'm not sure of the science exactly behind it, but it's interesting. I think what it is, it's actually sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is very interesting because it is 1 point mutation, right? That we know what it is. Eventually, we'll be able to correct it. Mostly seen in African American or African homologous based people, where I'm talking about the African motherland, I guess is the best way to say it, is that sometimes these people who suffer from sickle cell anemia are in fact immune to malaria. because they think through evolution is that the body has created this resistance to malaria. It just so happens to also create sickle cell anemia, which and if you ask me, it's just fascinating. Um, so yeah, yeah. I wish I could go into farther in depth about it, but it's kind of cool how it just so happens that folks who are have sickling in their red cells. I've only seen it about 2 or 3 times. I've actually seen it one time where you could see the parasite inside the red blood cell. They're called banana forms, and what they do is that you can literally see the parasite inside the red blood cell being harbored, and then eventually they will produce, where they will, yeah, exactly, Leah. They will explode out, and then they'll infect other red cells. And then when they infect other red cells, they will cause it to sickle. And the big thing about it is that, yes, they can carry oxygen, but the pain really comes from, and this is a pH issue, during exercise. Sometimes when you exercise, your pH lowers because you're building up lactic acid, right? And the little bit of pH, excuse me, I'm gonna be a little bit mobile here because I got to check on something. What happens is that when we sickle, it actually will cause these red cells to kind of deposit into the capillaries. And when they deposit in, excuse me, charges back in there, when it deposits in the capillaries is when it is what causes the pain. So sometimes you'll see people who are come to the ER and they're in pain because they're having what's called a sickling event, when the red blood cells will usually lodge in the fingers or the toes or somewhere in capillaries, and that's what causes pain. And you have to kind of give them something to bring the pH back up that helps this sickling, and they won't be, it kind of relieves the pain event, which is interesting. But back to our point, the malarial people, or excuse me, the sickle cell anemia patients are really immune to malaria, because if you think about it, like I just said, you have sickling events. Parasites, which is it's malaria, Plasmodium falciparum, Plasmodium malariae, and Plasmodium something else I cannot think of. There's 3 of them that cause malaria. Falciparum is the worst. They do not want to infect an already screwed up cell, for lack of a better term. They want to infect a actual real red blood cell. So when you have these sickling, it's kind of a defense against malaria. And evolutionists, physicians have a strong inkling that this is something has to do over time to combat malaria. So back to Candace's point, going back to genes and pathophysiology, I'm trying to tie this in here. That's what's kind of neat, is that genes can be related to all kinds of things. Very rarely do you see a mutation in defense to an infection, right? I mean, who knows what COVID would do to us thousands of years down the road or whatever. Probably, I mean, I don't know. It could. I don't know. I mean, usually the plague probably might have changed some things. Maybe COVID would change the things, but we don't know. It'll, human species, no telling what'll happen hundreds, if not thousands of years down the road. So yeah, that's when, back to my point here, is when we're talking about expressing genes, what we're really talking about is what Tristan said. We're producing proteins. Proteins carry out the function of these genes. If the proteins are not made correctly, sometimes they can have pathological events. Sometimes they'll be destroyed, but most of the time, these proteins actually carry out the purpose of those genes, whether it be hormones, enzymes, what we've talked about a few weeks ago, electrolyte transports. Proteins carry out all kinds of different functions in the body, and they're very important. Alzheimer's is what we consider a large deposit of protein called tau, T-A-O. Tau protein is what they think is pretty much a misguided protein or misfolded protein that the body cannot get rid of. And basically what happens is that it makes deposits into the hippocampus, into, different parts of the brain. And that's what they think causes Alzheimer's over time. And we can talk about proteins for a week if we wanted to. So the purpose is we're trying to kind of apply this to real life and see what happens. So I hope that answers your question, Candace. Let me know if we want to tweak that a little bit, or if we want to kind of elaborate. But that's the most important. How do we feel about endocrinology? Okay, yeah, thank you. How do we feel about endocrinology? Are we okay there? I know Jan and a few other people last night brought that up, which was very important. What chapters are we on tonight, by the way? Oh, the glands. Chapter 7. Thank you, Nathaniel. So what is chapter 7? You have to remind me. Okay, Kendi says they're stuck. Bones. All right, Nathaniel, we can get to bones, but let's talk about what Tristan and Kendi say. So what are we stuck on? We're stuck on glands. Can you elaborate a little bit for that and just kind of help guide me into the glands, like sweat glands? I don't think that's what you're talking about. You're probably talking about hormones, maybe. Hormone glands. Okay. So like maybe adrenal glands. That's all right. Help guide me in, Nathaniel. We'll talk about bones eventually. We can chisel out something with what your instructor's doing. That's okay. So Kendi says something like what Tristan says. We're talking about epigram. Okay, so we're probably talking about autocrine, endocrine, exocrine, and paracrine. Probably, right? Help me out on that. So these are basic categories of how we categorize glands, essentially. Autocrine are glands where whatever hormone they produce out actually will have receptors on the same gland. So you really don't have a hormone that creates very much efficiency or effectiveness if it doesn't have a receptor. Excuse me. So when we have a gland that releases a hormone, that hormone's really non-functional unless it has a receptor to bind to. Because what it does when that hormone binds to that receptor, it actually, the act of that hormone binding to that receptor causes issues within that cell. Okay. And this is called secondary messenger systems, a secondary cascade. Calcium comes and binds some things, turns some stuff on. Kinases get turned on, and we make changes in the nucleus to what? Express genes, back to what Candace said. All right, this is what hormones do. When we go through puberty, okay, when females ovulate, when females have pregnancy, when males produce sperm, I'm just going off of reproductive because we've all been through that. When we have growth hormone that we actually grow, when we have secondary sex characteristics, breasts and hair underneath the armpits, or a lower voice or higher voice, is all based off hormones binding to receptors and causing changes within these targeted cells, right? Because these cells are all here for a purpose. So I'm trying to kind of give an overview here of why we study endocrinology. So back to what Tristan was saying, we talk about autocrine, paracrine, endocrine, and exocrine. These are just vocabulary words that we want to really get underneath our belt, because these are easy 2 points, easy, 4 points. I looked over my exam one, and I could probably count up 6 points worth of easy vocabulary terms from one category. Okay, you cannot overlook the simple vocabulary terms on here. These are it. Autocrine basically is a gland that releases a hormone, and it just so happens that that same gland has the receptor on the surface. All right, this is my receptor over here, if you all can't figure that out. And let's say my head's the gland, and then it releases the hormone, and then it comes over and it binds, and then it trickles down and causes some issues within the cell. All right, that's basically what autocrine is. Endocrine is more like, think of it as like a regional area. Okay, endocrine is more like a tissue. You know how we talked about tissue, where it's just pretty much like a group of cells working together for a common goal. That is what endocrine is. It's not exactly paracrine. Paracrine, P-A-R-A-crine, paracrine is more like a larger view, right? Larger in the fact that it may go from here towards something else, a little bit larger than endocrine. And then we have, it's more like it goes to maybe a friend, like a neighboring cell that does the same thing. That's more endocrine, okay? And then we get into what's called exocrine, which is more hormonal, right? Where we send something from the hypothalamus to the pituitary, and then from the pituitary, it goes down to our adrenal glands. That's more hormonal. Hormone is what I should say. Sometimes I struggle with my pronunciation. Hormonal. And what that happens is that we have let's say we have catecholamines from it's not catecholamines. It's going to probably be like norepinephrine or something coming that's going to react to our adrenal glands. It's going to release catecholamines. And if you don't know what catecholamines, that's fine. But what that does is basically it's like coffee. It's a stimulant. What it does is it acts on your heart rate to increase the rate of your heart rate, or it causes functions like fight or flight in your muscles. If you see a fearful stimulus, you're either going to fight it or you're going to run from it. And that's what catecholamines does. And we can bring in, like, from some of you all who joined last night, we talked about metabolism and glycogen. Well, the interesting thing is that with glycogen that's deposited in the muscles, the reason why we have glycogen deposited in the muscles is that we use that glycogen to metabolize into glucose, and our muscles use that glucose to do fight or flight. So what happens is that's why we have glycogen inside of our muscles, because when we're running for something or we're in a fight, for whatever reason, we use the glycogen to break it down to glucose to have our muscles, excuse me, my cats are fighting, to, do whatever they need to do, whether it be run or fight. So very interesting there. So catecholamines really are, think of it as like coffee, right? That's why we have coffee's more of like a stimulant, and that's why we use coffee to we get a little spunk. Sometimes we may find ourselves using the bathroom when we drink coffee, because that stimulates the GI tract to release its contents. Coffee's for everything, and you can just kind of think of that as more like catecholamines, which come from the adrenal glands, which come from the pituitary glands, which come from the hypothalamus. So I'm not sure if I cleaned that up a little bit there, Tristan and Kennedy, Let me know. I've never really heard of Miracrine. I'm going to kind of sit up here for a minute. I've never heard of Miracrine. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what that means. Apocrine either. Sorry, we should probably Google those or go back to our notes. I'm not familiar with apocrine and miracrine. Oh, okay. Miracrine glands, such as salivary glands, pancreatic glands, and eccrine glands, sweat glands, are comprised of secretory cells that excrete products through excitosis. Oh, okay. We certainly didn't learn that when I was a student. Okay. That may be more for like animals. Maybe we're talking about like animal physiology with epicrines. Um, sweat glands secrete pheromones. It's kind of gross, in my opinion. But hey, if it's animal physiology, that's great. Yeah, I got you, Kennedy. Yeah, I think so too, Candace. So salivary glands, really the purpose of salivary glands, and we can learn this Miracrine glands. I've never heard that in my life. That's okay. I'm not perfect. That may be a new term, but when we're talking about salivary glands, the one thing salivary glands release is called amylase, right? And if you remember from my earlier spotlight sessions, when you see ACE, that means it's an enzyme, right? Amylase just so happens, and if you think about this, what do we usually eat, during the day? Or like what if you think about the American diet, and I'm not going to answer this, you all answer this. If you think about the American diet, yes, you can say hamburgers and fries, but what do you think really, yeah, all right, yeah, Candace answered it. It's carbs, right? Carbohydrates. So it just so happens that amylase breaks down amyloid, which is considered a carbohydrate, right? Fries, chips, cookies. I had a blizzard today from Dairy Queen. All right, it was awesome. And I probably should have not eaten it because I didn't know I was going to go out to dinner tonight, but it was awesome. So when we have salivary glands and they sense this polysaccharides, kind of like what I don't think Justin joined us tonight, but he did last time. He was talking about polysaccharides. We have these polysaccharides that have to get broken down. And one of the first places they actually do get broken down is through the salivary glands that release amylase, right? And what this amylase does, it makes certain cuts within the carbohydrate to break it down into, polysaccharides, disaccharides, and eventually glucose, otherwise known as monosaccharides, right? And that's important. That's how we use this to digest. So if you want to call salivary glands American glands, Miracrine glands, that's great. I can't elaborate any more than that. Pancreatic glands. What do we think about? Let's just touch on this for a minute. Let's just ride this out. Pancreatic glands. What in the pancreas are we really releasing? What's the big one? Yeah, Devin says insulin. Candace says insulin. Yeah, you're right. All right, let's take it deeper. From what cells do we release insulin from? Don't look it up. Question marks? Yeah, Kennedy's right. It's beta cells. Very good. Beta cells, and that's just something you guys are gonna have to know because diabetes. Welcome to 21st America. Diabetes is huge. You go to the physician, you go to the ER. What are the first two things they ask you? Do you smoke, and are you diabetic? Right? Those are the first two questions they'll ever ask you. That accounts for probably half of the healthcare bill in America between smoking and diabetic type 1 and particularly type 2. So insulin brings our sugar down, right? What hormone released from the pancreatic gland actually brings our glucose up? Let's see if we've studied this one. Okay. All right. That's okay. Yeah, it's glucagon. Very good, Kennedy. It's glucagon. Devin, you're right too. So glycogen, you may have heard from my previous, because we've talked about glycogen. Glycogen is pretty much glucose stored away in muscles and liver and stuff like that. And the reason, particularly the liver, the reason why we store glycogen in the liver is because when we go on a 18-hour fasting trip, because let's say when we're dieting, maybe we had some Mexican food tonight and a couple margarita drinks, and it's time for us to diet. So what happens is that for us to maintain our blood glucose levels once we digest, we really have to maintain our blood glucose levels, anywhere from 70 to 100, whatever it is. We start to pick off our glycogen stores. And glucagon does this. Glucagon, released from the pancreatic blank cells, I'm going to ask you all that next, will take glycogen and cut it into glucose, right? Because that's all it does. It just stores it. It just takes some hydrogens off and stores it in the liver. And then all of a sudden, glucagon will come in and start tacking on some hydrogens, and it breaks off. And then we use glucose, and we go into metabolism, glycolysis, citric acid cycle. What is it? What's the third one? Electron transport chain, stuff like that, right? We talked about that last night. So the question is kind of what Kennedy and Devin said. What cells make glucagon? Yeah, very good. All right, you saw that one coming. Very good. So alpha cells, and these are, and the reason why I'm harping on this is because more chances than not, when you get into the upper levels, they're going to ask you what cells, if somebody has type 2 diabetes, what cells are knocked out? Or no, excuse me, type 1 diabetes, what cells have been knocked out of the system or inept? The answer is going to be beta cells, because beta cells produce insulin. And if you know the difference between type 1 and type 2 is basically whether we have insulin cells, beta cells creating insulin or not. What they really think is that somebody who's somewhat contracted a virus, or maybe it's a virus that's triggered it, but they think it's really an autoimmune disease, where somewhere at some point the immune system attacks the beta cells and knocks out the beta cells. And once you knock out the beta cells, you're really knocking out insulin at all. And that's what happens when you have type 1 diabetes, juvenile diabetes. So type 2 is basically when we have glucose transporters that are not sensitized to insulin, and that causes glucose not to be brought into the cells. Those are the kind of two differences between type 1 and type 2. But to Kennedy's point, when we are on a fast, let's say we're doing the keto diet, right? Keto diet basically means that we're eating nothing but meats, we're cutting off our carbohydrates. The purpose of the keto diet is to burn through all of your glycogen in your liver and maybe some of your muscles. And what happens is that then you start kind of switching over to fats. And when we start to burn fats, we start to make ketones, hence the keto diet. And what that is that, you kind of got to be careful with all that. There's plus and minuses to keto diet, particularly with cholesterol and LDL. But that's kind of how we try to lose weight, because we try not to take on too much carbohydrates. But yeah, enough of that. I'm not going to go any further into that. What else do we want to discuss tonight? I think somebody said something else. I got to look it up. All right, Nathaniel, what was your instructor talking about? I'm lost. Bones? Is that what we're talking about? Bones. Okay. So my take on bones, and correct me if I'm wrong. Correct. I don't mean to be. I say this in a very respectful manner. I think bones are probably the more easier parts, according to my experience in this class, because it's just memorization. Okay. And feel free to light me up if you want, or correct me, or maybe I'm in the wrong part here. But bones, in my opinion, are like flashcards, because particularly in lab, right? I mean, we can go over the different bone layers and stuff like that. We go into osteoclasts and osteoblasts if you want. That is more physiology, that's more conceptual. But if you're trying to identify what the mandible is versus the nasal cavity versus the frontal bone or the temporal bone, those are kind of like flashcards. That just kind of takes time. So maybe I'm misunderstanding you or something like that. But the facial bones can be a little bit tedious. Um, Typically in the past, if students study hard, then they will perform well on bones, because it's just memorization, I guess, in my opinion. Is that kind of what you were talking about there? Excuse me. Okay. Well, I'm gonna sit back again. So osteo, there's two things, and they work kind of hand in hand. And I'm not sure if you joined us last night when we talked about osteoporosis and PTH and calcitonin. We won't talk about that tonight. Actually, I'll probably refresh. Candace, this is probably old school for you, because I remember you from last night. When we have an elevated hormone of PTH, which you'll learn about this in chapter 7, it's called parathyroid hormone. And it just so happens that there's a tendency for postmenopausal women to have an elevation of PTH, otherwise known as parathyroid hormone, right? Now, I don't get into this yet, but when you talk about postmenopausal women, the one thing that drops off at this stage of life is estrogen. When estrogen drops off, and that causes menopause, it will cause an elevation of PTH. And what PTH does is that it regulates the amount of calcium inside the plasma. So when we're running low of calcium inside the plasma, PTH is going to go get more. And what it does is it goes and it robs the bones of calcium. And over time, this causes osteoporosis, because that's kind of like the bone density is thinning. If we fall, old people, some elderly people, some fall and they'll break a bone. And this is sometimes women particularly are osteoporotic. So where does osteoblast and osteoclast come in, right? I'm going to talk about osteoclasts, by the way, not osteocytes. Osteocytes is more like a general term. I just want to kind of differentiate here. Osteoblasts versus osteoclasts. And we building bone up, we use osteoblasts. Blasts, building. Okay? Building bone, osteoblasts. Calcitonin will take high levels of calcium in the serum and bring them back down. Okay, how does it do this? It actually puts deposited calcium into the bone. So Nathaniel asked, do they break their bones so easily because they have more like density, Nathaniel, more like density in the aspect where we have PTH hormone that pretty much. All right, well, we've already kind of talked about this, right? Let me just tie this together. We have osteoclasts, which is our cells, right? These are actual bone cells in the bone. They have receptors on their surface. This is the receptor over here. when PTH, which is over here, gets released from the parathyroid hormone, right here, parathyroid hormone. The thyroid's in the middle. The para means on the side. Parathyroid hormone. It will release PTH. When it releases PTH, this is the hormone PTH. All of a sudden, it finds its receptor on the osteoclast, on the bone. So what happens when PTH binds to its receptor on the osteoclast? It'll cause secondary messengers, that travel. It's like a cascade that travels inside the cell. And before you know it, that osteoclast has freed up some calcium deposits inside that bone. When it does that, you're pretty much taking out the building blocks of the actual bone, whether it be the hip, because maybe the hip has a lot of osteoclasts located in the hip that have receptors to PTH, right? If you don't have the receptors, do a damn thing. But if you have osteoclasts with the receptor, then that means whenever time that hormone binds that receptor, something's going to happen. We just don't know what. Yeah, you're right. You're right. We have osteoporotic women tend to have an excess activity of osteoclasts, particularly in the hips or the femurs, because they break hips, right? Sometimes that ball and socket joint in the femur that connects to the hip, if something were to happen, then the head on the ball and socket joint of that femur will blow through the hip, the incus. I can never think of that. I'm not going to do this last night. I can't do it tonight. I don't know. I cannot remember the bones of the hip. I'll remember them eventually. They're very almost identical, and there's 3 of them. I'll get it eventually, but it doesn't matter. The point is that the ball and socket joint of the hip blow through, and that's how you get a hip fracture, part of them. So yes, Nathaniel, to your point, you're kind of right. Osteoclasts are more bone destroying. Now, let's flip that. Let's flip that over. What if you go to the doctor and the doctor gives you some medication, and then all of a sudden we start activating our osteoblasts? Blasts mean building. Okay, that's great, but how are we doing that? We could be taking calcium supplements. It's possible. But if we really want to kick this in, because if you take calcium supplements, what are we doing? We're not banging it, right? We're not taking IVs. We're probably swallowing a pill, which goes into our stomach, which means it's going into our small intestine. It's going to be reabsorbed or absorbed in our small intestine. However, not all of it's going to be absorbed. Some of it's going to go through the large intestine, probably get kicked out in our excrement, or we're going to urinate it out. However, if we really want to turn it on full speed, maybe we'll give somebody some calcitonin, because calcitonin is the hormone, right? And some of us are there. Some of us have reached chapter 7. Some of us have not. But I'm going to just kind of give you a little prelude here. When we have calcitonin, say we give an injection, or my slang term, we bang some calcitonin into our IV, that will cause the osteoblast to be, yeah, I know, right? I mean, you got to make a little bit of fun at 10 o'clock at night. You got to, when you take the calcitonin, you really have to activate the osteoblasts. And what the osteoblasts do is that they will build up bone density, right? They'll build up the bone density to the fact where they need to be normal, right? And then eventually, if we have excess calcium, then we'll just excrete it out either through the urine or through the stool. So there, and this all goes back to what do we learn about the first day? I'm going to type this out in full caps. It's important.
homeostasis, right? What we're really explaining here is homeostasis. Now, osteoporosis is not homeostasis. That's pathophysiology. That is the pathology. But when we are in our younger years, we have these set points. We know how much calcium has to be in the serum. We know how much calcium has to be in the bone. And our body does the utmost effort and purpose to maintain that homeostasis at all times. It just so happens that in older women, when we go through not post menopause, or maybe postmenopausal, that we have some significant changes. Homeostasis changes. Why? Because we have a drop in estrogen. Estrogen carries out all kinds of things. Not only does it play roles in baby development and pregnancy and female lady time, as I call it, but it also does things with the rest of the body. It plays a role in cholesterol. Most women who are premenopausal have very high HDL, which is very good cholesterol. And that's the reason why maybe we have more heart disease in postmenopausal women who have, bad lifestyles or bad diet, is because estrogen all of a sudden drops off. And so now you have to maybe watch a little bit more of what you eat for your ticker, your heart. Okay. And the point I guess I'm trying to make is that it's all about homeostasis. It's what you learn from day one. So I won't rattle on too much beyond that because it's almost 9:50. I feel like I've talked the whole time and we haven't covered much. Well, we've actually covered a lot. Maybe we've really dug down to the details, which is good. So, do we want to touch on anything else tonight? Okay. Going once, going twice. We got a good crowd tonight. We've had 18 people. Last night we had 30, which was awesome. Okay. Chelsea's already checked out. All right. Sounds good. Thank you, Kennedy. Thank you for the feedback. Okay. All right, guys. Well, then we'll call it for tonight. All right. I will get the attendance down tonight. I need to do that from last weekend tonight. All right. We'll catch you next time. Keep bringing your questions and concepts. We'll get it going. Devin, Leah, Jennifer, Savannah, Holly, Nicole, thank you guys. Candace, see you next night or next time. And we'll catch you guys later. Have a good night. Happy Tuesday. Thank you, Anna. Yeah, Amar. Yeah, I know, right? You're funny.